So that was it. The last of Vikings we will ever get. The last fight for power in Kattegat, the last battle in England, and the last words ever spoken. But nonetheless, we still have the final episode to go through, and there is so much in this. And I want to start with Ivar the Boneless. Even in the battle of episode 19, when Ivar had organized so much, preparing the battlefield in advance, planning the fight beat by beat, and even when he coordinated his men from afar with the horns, the battle ended up turning into complete carnage as they basically just collided into each other with swords in hand. And so these opening shots of episode 20 show us just how devastating the fight really was. The men are so deflated from the battle that when these archers come up and draw their bows, they barely even move. The whole thing comes across as really janky and messy, like the way they do the entire negotiations is just by having a guy stab a random spear in the ground and what looks like a hastily hand-tied on piece of white fabric. All the men are just like standing around looking confused. Alfred doesn't even know how to address him. When Ivar walks up, he like spits on the ground, doesn't really even face him properly. It was clear that Ivar was going for a very intentionally cavalier and casual conversation, almost undermining the kind of serious tone and speeches that Alfred throws at him. Like the funniest moment of the entire episode was when Alfred was going so hard with that speech, speaking about how winter brings eternal death and spring brings eternal life and they won't bow to his tyranny. And Ivar just looked at him and just like, so that's a no? Over the episode, we see so many moments where Viking shows the parallels between these two figures, but this one kind of showed us their differences and how they clash so heavily. It seems to be that same tragic relationship we see over and over in Vikings, where we have these deeply ambitious characters with their visions and dreams and goals, and the people who are most like them, the ones they get along with the most and form the greatest friendships with, are the ones they always end up fighting because they have their own goals too. That's why they respect them. One of the parallels that stood out the most during the battle was when Alfred was screaming out to his god, asking him where he is, as all the pointless death and suffering around him makes him question his belief. But at the exact same time, we see Ivar is very much in the same boat, screaming out to Odin for guidance and getting nothing. This never really was a conflict between the Christian god and the Norse gods, this was a conflict between Ivar and Alfred. And what a battle it was. So of course, Ivar's not going to enter a battle with at least one trick up his sleeve, so they whip these catapults out of nowhere in the trees and start using them to hit the enemy. And whoever's controlling them has some pinpoint accuracy because they take down that cross first shot. And yet again, like in the previous scene with the archers, we see these Saxon soldiers have balls of steel as they don't even flinch. It did seem a bit weird and very cruel for them to keep using the catapults, even after the Viking troops had already clashed and intermingled with the Saxon ones. Like they're just taking out their own troops at that point. But for the first half of this fight, we just follow Hvitserk massacring everyone. Like he seemed to be in a perpetual state of 1v10 at all times, and yet was still winning everything. For the most part, because the battle was so chaotic and the shaky cam was insane, we don't really have any understanding of who's winning and what the pace of the battle's like. We do see at some point Ivar gets pretty restless and decides to enter the battlefield himself. And it could have been because he saw his forces waning or something developing badly, but to be honest, I don't really know. So we see Ivar making his way over to Hvitserk in the battle, and the music starts playing, we're getting flashbacks between the two of them, and the next minute he's on the ground, he's panting, people were surrounding him, and I'm thinking, whoa, they're gonna kill Hvitserk? But no, Ivar comes in, he meets him, and tells him to back off. He says his work is done and he doesn't need to interfere anymore and that this is his moment, and I don't know whether that was a move to try and save Hvitserk because he thought the battle was going sideways, but those last words he did give to Hvitserk did seem like a goodbye, and what he did next very much felt like he was facing his death. And for as strange as this battle was, I really did love the way they took out Ivar. Vikings always does these poetic deaths that are very surreal, and they did the same here with Ivar as well. He screams and bangs his chest and declares his presence, almost drawing the warriors to him, taunting them with jibes saying he can't be killed to come at him and that he will live forever. And then we get that beautifully shot sequence where he imitates the moves and cunning blows of the soldiers protecting him. Ivar's prowess has always been his strategy, his mind, and he works through the tools and instruments of his warriors. Normally he does it from a vantage point afar, as an observer, as a commander, but in this sequence they bring us closer, seeing him as almost a puppet master directly controlling those around him, which I thought was a perfect way to kind of demonstrate his true strength, compared to a character like Hvitserk who very much just swings around an axe to show how strong he is. And then we see the soldier that we've kind of followed ever since Alfred's first speech. As he approaches, and Ivar tells him to not be afraid, which is straight up Ragnar's quote to Ubbe when he was urging him to send him to the king of Northumbria so that the revenge of the sons of Ragnar would go there. So both father and son use the same phrase to convince someone to bring about the death that they desire. Though it was a little bit comedic and stupid the way he just shanked them a bunch of times, which was them kind of shaking us out of that moment and not glorifying his death too much, like even the dagger size itself was comically small. So Alfred sees Ivar go down, calls a stop to the battle, and Hvitserk comes to the side of his brother to hear his final words. Throughout the entire episode, they push how pointless and futile this violence is. We saw in every scene with Harold, he just wanted to die, he wanted to come to rest, that's why he came here. And Ivar had very much the same motivations. He wanted a legacy, to be famous, to be feared. He didn't really want to rule England or settle the land or anything that normally brings people to these battles. So with them both gone, it becomes so clear that everything is pointless and everyone just kind of puts down their arms. The way of life these people were living is no longer relevant. The golden age of the Vikings died with Ivar. With Ubbe far away in a different world entirely, and Hvitserk converting to Christianity, the story and saga of the sons of Ragnar has truly come to a close. And I guess Alfred wins the match after all. But they use Ubbe's storyline throughout this episode in a really clever way. They contrast the opportunities and the hope and the optimism of this unexplored new land with the sad, depressing realities of following the old way in England. Floki talks about how he felt he was trapped in sadness, and that he called out to the gods and no longer heard their voice, just like Ivar on the battlefield. Odir speaks to Ubbe about not repeating those mistakes and letting this opportunity of a new world be corrupted by the same flaws. So as Ivar finishes his story dying in the mud, crying his eyes out, afraid of what's next, Ubbe is reunited with a great friend, cuddled up in a blanket looking over a beautiful sunset with a whole life of opportunity ahead of him. And we're confronted with the idea that maybe it isn't too sad that we're moving past the golden age of the Vikings. But let's go back to when Floki first reunited with Ubbe. I would say that all of the scenes with Floki were done really well this episode. It was cool to see that they were able to recapture that same spirit and charm that Floki always had. So when we do sit down and we start hearing some of his stories, we think we're going to unravel those mysteries we've had for so long. But Vikings was really going for a theme of letting go of the past and moving forward. And that's something that Floki has really embraced as well. He's not interested in revisiting the same sad story of violence from Flatnose or debating about the gods and what's real, because at this point it doesn't really matter. Even though I was super curious about how they would do this when I was watching those episodes back then, now that we're in this new place and we're at the end of the series, it does feel kind of unimportant. Like we already know Flatnose is a bad guy, he massacred half of Greenland. And they even use the settler Nad and his greed for gold as an example of why you should let go. So it didn't seem this guy was very smart from the get-go. He kind of just walks into this hut, doesn't check it properly, starts rummaging around to see if he can find some gold. And when he gets spotted by the child, he really could have played dumb and used the language barrier to get away with it, but instead he whips out a knife, starts pointing at the kid's face and demanding gold. Not exactly subtle. And if it wasn't obvious enough that he had no plan or forward thinking, he cuts a man down on the way out and tries to run for it. But that's quite hard to do when you're in the middle of their village and you're playing on their turf in the first place. So Ubbe and Torvi and the rest come forward and they have a discussion about what should be done, and they agree to hand him over if he gets punished appropriately. It was pretty confusing to understand how they were able to converse so easily, but they do have Floki in the middle, and it seems he did learn the language already, and so it's possible that he's kind of translating, but they don't want to waste our time by showing that. And then we got that beautiful sequence of the burial ritual as they cross between the trial and discussion of what they should do next. And that's when Ubbe decides they're going to blood eagle him. Ordinarily, if he puts up a brave face and shows that he can suffer through the pain, then it gives him a chance to reach Valhalla as he proves his courage. But unsurprisingly, people who point knives at kids demanding gold aren't exactly the most courageous. And so Ubbe decides just to put him out of his misery. And the final scene of the entire series is Ubbe and Floki just talking, person to person, on a beach during a sunset. And Ubbe gives us the last words of the entire series. Is that the end? Oh, and Floki complains about Ragnar.
Keeps asking me to build him a new boat. And I say, what the hell do you need a new boat for, Ragnar? You're dead.
So we got to the end of the season, of the show, of these reviews. Thank you so much for all the support, all the comments, all the engagement. It's been so fun to have this experience with you guys. Like, I like Vikings, I like this show, but you guys make it something special. And I don't think this show would be nearly as good if it wasn't for you guys here watching it with me. Skull.